What on earth does ethics have to do with the recovery of human remains? Everything, actually. And hopefully, in restating your question, I've sort of answered it there. But it goes to the heart of archaeological practice. The central focus of our practice is more often than not human remains. And how we deal with them, therefore, is crucial to our training. It's also tied up with legal issues as well. This particular comment is linked with the discovery of Richard III, and I'll come on to that in just a second. But, for example, in the first instance, if you discover human remains, quite often on an archaeological site, you have to call the police in to confirm that these remains have been found and that they're not recent, i.e., they're not a murder, for example. That is a massive ethical concern and quandary, making sure that these are actually the long dead and not recently deceased. Beyond that, the Home Office actually issues license and guidance on how to deal with the excavation of human remains. One stipulation is that they should be out of public view. Another one is linked with the dignity of those remains and looking after them, studying them, and then maybe even reinterring them in a way which is appropriate. It's kind of at the heart of what archaeologists do and also what we're concerned about when it comes to handling the dead. Now that applies in precisely the same way, regardless of someone's status in life. But in this instance, in the case of Richard III, knowing exactly who this skeleton was crucial to the whole project. Actually getting to the to positively identify Richard III was the whole point. And on that day, when those remains were uncovered, we need to remember a couple of things. First of all, actually, Philippa Langley of the Richard III Society uh, didn't want them to be his remains initially. If you recall, she didn't want him to have scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, and yet, uh, because of of having found this skeleton where they found it, she became convinced that it was Richard's remains. The other member of the Richard III Society who was there on the day did have a standard, I think, in his car. We see him unfurling it like a picnic blanket, ready to deploy and to rest over Richard's remains as they are taken out of the ground. But at that point, we didn't know that they were Richard's remains. And in asking Joe Appleby, the osteologist and excavator who was working on the skeleton, to carry them with a not only an identifier of an individual, but also a royal standard, was really at risk of not only breaching the ethics around handling human remains, but also playing with them, if not actually cosplaying with them, cosplaying a pseudo medieval ritual with bones whose identity we haven't yet tied down, we haven't yet fully appreciated. Now, Richard Buckley is shown in that footage as saying, well, the identity is fairly clear, so actually I'm quite comfortable with that. And I don't know if that's because he's on camera or if because he had a particular relationship with Philippa Langley and he just felt that this, oh, it's fine, it's probably Richard, it'll be fine. But technically speaking, it was ethically dodgy. And this is why Joe is shown at the end of the car park, I think about to get into her vehicle, saying that she's not entirely comfortable with this because she's trained to approach human remains with those key aspects of focus, dignity, and respect. Now, some people at this point out that she apparently damaged Richard's skull. Supposedly, it was in a position that she wasn't expecting due to the curvature of the spine. These things do happen. I know many archaeologists who have accidentally damaged human remains in their recovery, sometimes because they're very brittle and very delicate, or not just brittle, but sometimes sort of waterlogged and very friable. They sort of come apart, and sometimes because of essentially a geometric issue. You think it's going to be there, it's here, and oh dear. But crucially, the moment she made that sort of mistake, she would have done everything she could to recover the rest of the skull as perfectly as possible. Again, uh, it's the difference between um, stomping on a skull and accidentally coming into contact with it. It's interesting how some folks have tried to represent that as not being careful. Um, it's just something that happens when you're digging up a skeleton, unfortunately, or can happen rather. So ethics is central in the case of the recovery of human remains, and in this instance, when we think it might be Richard III, but we don't know, no one knew. Remember, we were excavating at the Greyfriars complex, so there could have been any number of bodies in that location. Could have been a monk or a friar with curvature of the spine. We didn't know, and so it was ethically shaky ground to pretend that we did, because it's pretending. It's potentially playing with human remains, and we just don't do that. And no right-thinking people do play with human remains. If you are playing with human remains, then you need to think about your life. So ultimately, ethics is at the dead center, at the heart of our concerns when it comes to the recovery of human remains. And I'm not going to apologize for that. I don't think that anything other than a very careful, sober, and uh, neutral as possible approach to human remains, particularly when we don't know whose remains they are, is respectful. And anything else runs the risk of of being less than respectful. Hmm.